When Britain went into the Second World War, one of its standard anti-tank guns was the 2-pounder. Officially it was called the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a fairly small gun by later standards, with a bore of 40mm. Its armour-piercing rounds weighed around 1.2 kilograms, and with conventional APCBC ammunition, it could push them out at roughly 792 meters per second. At the beginning of the war, that was enough to deal with many enemy tanks. The problem was that tank design did not stand still. Armour got thicker, layouts improved, and what had once been adequate quickly started to feel underpowered. Inside the War Office and Ordnance Committees, people knew this. They began looking for ways to squeeze more penetration out of the 2-pounder without tearing up everything that depended on it. They were boxed in on all sides. That industry was already stretched. Vehicle designs had fixed turret rings and weight limits. Many tanks and armoured cars were built around the 2-pounder. Simply swapping in a bigger 6-pounder gun was not a minor tweak. It would have meant reshaping turrets, rebalancing mountings, changing production lines, and messing with existing contracts. Replacing every 2-pounder in one sweep was not realistic. They needed a way to make the gun hit harder while keeping the hardware largely the same. The 2-pounder sat in a lot of places. Some cruiser tanks had it, some infantry tanks too, and armoured cars like the Daimler mounted it as their main armament. Those vehicles did not have much spare room or structural margin to handle something larger. A 6-pounder would not simply drop in, it would require real surgery. And so the British started paying attention to an idea that already existed on paper and in foreign experiments, the squeeze bore concept. The basic idea behind squeeze bore is strangely simple. You start with a normal caliber barrel, but near the muzzle you narrow it down. A tapered liner or extension gradually reduces the diameter as the projectile travels forward. The shot goes in at full caliber, then gets squeezed down as it moves through the taper. The outer part of the projectile is designed to deform, while a hard inner core stays intact. As the diameter shrinks, the frontal area goes down. The same gas pressure now pushes a smaller cross-section, which means higher velocity. The result is a faster round and a flatter trajectory, with better armour penetration for the same basic gun. And engineers like Gerlich had already played with this kind of system before the war, so the principle was not entirely new. One of the key figures on the British side of this story was the Czech engineer František Janeček. Before the war, he had explored these designs, and when he ended up in Britain, his expertise came with him. His surname translates roughly to Littlejohn in English, and from that came the name the British stuck on the device, the Littlejohn adapter. It was an odd, almost informal label for a very serious piece of kit, but it stuck. His work slotted neatly into what the British were desperate for, incremental upgrades that squeezed more performance from what they already had. Physically, the Littlejohn adapter was not a complete gun on its own. It was a fairly compact, a tapered steel sleeve that screwed onto the muzzle of the 2-pounder. Inside, the bore narrowed gradually from about 40mm at the entry to roughly 30mm at the exit. The taper had to be very smooth and very precise, carefully machined and perfectly concentric with the original bore. On the outside it looked mostly cylindrical, with reinforced collars and flats where a spanner could grip it. The threads that fixed it to the muzzle had to be long and robust enough to hold under repeated firing, and the sealing surfaces needed to be good enough to keep gas from leaking around the joint. On its own, though, the adapter was useless. The system depended on specially designed ammunition. The British used the term APCNR, which stands for Armour Piercing, Composite, Non-Rigid, and they also also called it APSV Armour Piercing. Super velocity. This was not just a regular shell spun through a narrow ring. The projectile was built from the outset to be squeezed. Inside, the shot had two main parts. The heart of it was a dense tungsten alloy core, the actual penetrator. Around that sat a softer, lightweight alloy body with flanges or projections on the outside. At loading, this outer body filled the 40mm bore like any normal round. The soft flanges engaged the rifling, sealing gas and taking the spin. During firing, as pressure rose in the chamber and the shot started to move, those soft outer sections were designed to deform. The non-rigid structure let the shell compress radially in a controlled way as it hit the tapered section of the adapter. As long as the projectile was inside the main 40mm barrel, and its behaviour looked much like any other full-bore shot. It ran down the rifled section, the flanges took the spin, and gas pressure built up behind the base. The big difference came when the projectile entered the adapter. There, the taper and the inner surfaces forced the outer carrier inward around the tungsten core, The diameter shrank from about 40mm to around 30mm. The soft alloy flowed under pressure and constraint, while the tungsten core stayed essentially the same shape inside. By the time it left the muzzle, what came out was a smaller diameter, high-velocity projectile. The performance jump was not just theoretical. Standard APCNR 2-pounder shot left the muzzle at roughly 792 meters per second. With APSV Mark II, fired through the Littlejohn, muzzle velocity climbed to around 1,143 meters per second. The lighter APSV Mark I could produce even higher figures in the tables. Unsurprisingly, penetration numbers rose too. One often quoted figure is about 88mm of penetration at 450 meters, which brings the modest 2-pounder into territory usually associated with larger 6-pounder guns using advanced ammunition. For planners looking at German armour steadily thickening, those numbers were attractive. From the War Office point of view, the adapter looked like a neat way to stretch the life of an aging weapon. Instead of writing off the 2-pounder as obsolete, they could give it a second wind against newer armour. That meant less immediate retooling of factories for bigger guns and fewer urgent redesigns of turrets and hulls. Existing vehicles could keep their mountings. Stockpiles of 2-pounder barrels, mounts and accessories still had value. As budgets stayed steadier, at least on paper. Making it work in reality, though, meant touching a lot of different systems. First, the guns themselves needed to be compatible. Barrels had to be machined with the correct muzzle threads and tolerances. New manufacturing drawings laid out those dimensions. Inspectors checked thread pitch, concentricity and finish with gauges before a gun was cleared for service with the adapter. Vehicles already in use received technical instructions explaining whether and how the adapter could be fitted. Then there was the ammunition side. Production lines had to start turning out APCNR shells in their cases. Filling plants had to handle revised propellant charges and new packaging. Ballistic tables needed to be recalculated because APSV rounds did not behave like standard AP in flight. The training manuals had to be updated with new range corrections and sight settings. Frontline units received firing tables for both regular ammunition and the new supervelocity shot, and gunners had to learn when and how to use each. British test ranges went through it all in a methodical way. At proof ranges, they measured muzzle velocity with chronographs. In armour trials, they shot at plates of varying thickness and hardness, at different ranges and angles, recording what went through and what did not. Test plates were made to standard specifications so that results would be comparable. Sometimes high-speed cameras were used to watch the impact and fragmentation. Afterwards, technicians picked over the plates and the recovered cores and fragments to see how the projectile behaved under real conditions. That reports compared APSV against the older AP, APHV and APCBC rounds. They did not just care about whether the shot went through, but also about what kind of hole it left and what happened behind the armour. The reduced caliber penetrators tended to punch narrower holes. The Littlejohn system gave a high chance of penetrating in the first place, especially within its effective range. But once inside, the behind armour effect could be less dramatic than some heavier, larger diameter rounds. Against lightly armoured vehicles, the increased penetration was clearly helpful. Against tougher targets, success still depended heavily on where exactly the shot hit. On paper, the Littlejohn looked like a sensible compromise. In the field, life was messier. For crews, it introduced another layer of configuration to think about. The same 2-pounder now effectively had two modes. With the standard muzzle, you could fire the full range of ammunition. Solid shot, high explosive, practice. With the adapter fitted, you unlocked the high-velocity APCNR rounds, but lost access to HE and other non-adapted shells. A high-explosive shell simply could not be forced safely through the squeezed bore. That meant any mistake in loading could be catastrophic. This raised awkward questions at the level of units and individual vehicles. Commanders had to decide when the adapters should actually be on the guns. Some standing orders might say to fit them in sectors where heavy enemy armour was expected. Other guidance suggested keeping the guns in their standard form most of the time, only fitting the adapter when a clear anti-tank threat existed. But whatever choice they made had direct consequences. It changed what ammunition could be used in the first seconds of an unexpected encounter. Think of an armoured car unit out on reconnaissance. Their job might involve anything from engaging enemy vehicles to firing HE at gun positions or buildings. If they kept the adapter on, they had excellent anti-tank performance but were locked into that special ammunition. If they left it off, they kept flexibility, HE for soft targets, regular AP for lighter armour, and so on. To switch configurations in the middle of a fight, the crew had to halt, climb partly out of the vehicle, manhandle the adapter, spin it off or on, and then return to action. Under fire, that was a lot to ask. Handling the adapter itself was not trivial either. It had weight and needed steady control while fitting. Getting the thread started correctly required care. Dirt, rust, or minor damage could make it difficult to install smoothly. Crews in the field did not have the clean, controlled environment of a workshop. They ended up carrying spanners, grease, and rags along with everything else, just to keep the adapter serviceable and ready. Official doctrine treated the Littlejohn as a tool that could be added or removed as needed. Fit it when a serious anti-tank threat was expected. Take it off again when general flexibility mattered more. In practice, the pace of operations did not always allow for that kind of fine-tuning. Enemy contacts were unpredictable. Units could move from one type of task to another without much warning. The tidy logic of doctrine often slipped when faced with the reality of dust, noise, and uncertainty. Over time, though reports and later recollections show an interesting pattern, crews discovered that APCNR or APSV ammunition would still work reasonably well even with the adapter removed. The shot did not benefit as much as it did in full squeezebore mode, but its tungsten core still gave better performance than older steel shot. The gap between squeezed and unsqueezed performance existed, but depending on the range, it was not always decisive. At many practical combat distances, the unsqueezed APSV round was still good enough. Because of that, some crews quietly shifted their priorities. Rather than always bothering with the adapter, they focused on stocking the better ammunition. In some units, Littlejohn adapters spent more time in racks or boxes than on gun muzzles. The vehicles would carry APCNR as their main anti-armour round, but keep the gun in its normal configuration, preserving the option to fire HE and avoiding the hassle and risk of swapping setups under pressure. From a neat design standpoint, this was not what the system had been meant for, but it is how people on the ground often chose to use it. Seen from the ordnance bureaucracy, this looked like a loss of intended efficiency. A carefully developed accessory was not being used to its full technical potential, yet the procurement system kept ordering APSV ammunition. Depots still accounted for the adapters as issued equipment. Inspection routines included them for periodic checks and maintenance. Workshop instructions covered cleaning away rust, inspecting the taper, and checking dimensions with gauges. On paper, the system remained alive. So the Littlejohn idea did not stay confined to Britain either. American Ordnance tested a similar adapter on their 37mm M3 gun. The results were not encouraging. Under repeated firing, the US version showed structural problems and began to distort after relatively few rounds. That sort of behaviour made American planners wary of going further down the squeezebore path, at least in that form. Back in British service, the main users of the Littlejohn were not heavy tanks but lighter vehicles. Daimler armoured cars were prominent among them, and some Tetrarch light tanks also used the system. These platforms had very limited room and weight capacity for bigger guns, so the Littlejohn offered a way to keep them dangerous to newer enemy armour without a major redesign. In that sense, it genuinely bridged a gap during a crucial period in the war. Behind the scenes, the engineering paperwork for the adapter laid down its material and manufacturing requirements in a dry but revealing way. The sleeve had to be made from heat-treated alloy steel, strong enough to cope with high internal pressures and rapid heating. Machining tolerances specified how smooth and precise the taper had to be. Bore roughness had to be kept low, because any ridges or pits could damage the projectile as it squeezed, upsetting the controlled flow of the soft outer carrier. Quality control staff used plug gauges, tapered mandrels and other tools to confirm that each adapter matched the drawings. Externally, the adapters were usually parkerized or painted to protect them from corrosion, and the threads were lightly oiled if they were going into storage. Crates had separators so that metal surfaces would not knock against each other in transit. Packing lists recorded serial numbers so that each piece could be traced. Depot clerks logged every issue and return in ordnance ledgers, building a paper trail of where each adapter went and which unit was responsible for it. Ballistics laboratories also looked at wear over time. The squeezebore section, especially near the muzzle, had to deal with very hot gases and abrasive particles concentrated in a narrower passage. Test schedules involved firing strings of APSV rounds and then gauging the bore to see if the tape had widened or warped. As they learned more, they adjusted estimates of how long an adapter could remain in service before needing repair or replacement. Gunners using the system noticed some straightforward differences. Muzzle blast and flash tended to be more pronounced because the gases were venting from a narrower exit at higher speed. Range staff made sure crews understood the firing signature and the importance of hearing protection. Recoil felt slightly different due to the lighter projectiles and altered pressure curve, but in general the hydraulic recoil systems of the mounts coped without major trouble. Training materials put a lot of stress on correctly identifying ammunition. APCNR or APSV cartridges had distinct markings and colours. Gunners were warned repeatedly not to mix incompatible rounds by mistake. Firing a high explosive shell through the adapter could block the bore and result in serious damage to the gun and a real risk to the crew. To reduce that risk, many units physically separated ammunition by type in different lockers or bins, tied to whether the adapter was expected to be in use. On exercises, instructors sometimes staged side-by-side demonstrations. They would fire standard AP and then APSV, letting crews watch the difference through range scopes. APSV rounds showed noticeably flatter trajectories, especially as distances increased. Shorter time of flight made it easier to hit moving targets. In the neat environment of a training range, the advantages were obvious. In combat, though, the choice was never that clean. Decisions about whether to fit the adapter were made under time pressure and with incomplete information. Commanders weighed the benefit of extra penetration against the possibility that targets might be mixed. On reconnaissance or in fluid situations, the flexibility of the plain gun often felt safer. As a result, actual field practice drifted away from the idealized usage patterns imagined on whiteboards and in reports. From an engineering perspective, the Littlejohn adapter is a good example of taking an existing asset and extracting more performance out of it through clever design. It allowed the 2-pounder to punch above its original weight by relying on advanced projectiles rather than a new gun. From a systems perspective, it added complexity. Every extra configuration and special round meant more decisions, more training, more room for error. That friction showed up in stowage plans, in quick orders on the net, and in the personal habits of crews who quietly made their own trade-offs. After the war, when people look back at taper-bore and squeeze-bore weapons in general, a pattern emerged. These systems never became the norm. Tapered barrels and adapters demanded high-precision machining and careful maintenance. The very high velocities they produced could accelerate wear in the narrow sections. Special ammunition types made supply chains more complicated than sticking with standard full-bore rounds. At the same time, discarding sabot technology was maturing, offering a different way to get high-velocity penetrators without permanently narrowing the barrel. Within British service, the 2-pounder slowly stepped aside for the 6-pounder and other heavier guns as vehicles were redesigned or updated. Wherever a larger gun could be fitted, it usually was. Armored cars kept the 2-pounder longer, as they had less room to grow, but even they eventually moved to new weapons. And as those platforms left frontline service, the Littlejohn's neck shrank with them. The adapters themselves followed the path of many wartime inventions. Some were scrapped in routine cleanouts of stores, others ended up in museums, training collections, or private hands. The surviving pieces make the concept easy to visualize. You can hold one and see the smooth internal taper that quietly turns a 40mm bore into something closer to 30mm by the time the projectile exits. For historians and enthusiasts, the Littlejohn adapter is a small but telling case study. It shows how engineers tried to upgrade existing weapons instead of discarding them outright. It also underlines how technical success is not enough on its own. Any solution has to fit human habits, logistics, doctrine, and the urgency of real operations. And on the test range and in the paperwork, the device did exactly what it promised. In the field, its partial acceptance and patchy use were shaped by the messy reality around it. In the broader story of the 2-pounder, the Littlejohn is one of several attempts to keep an aging gun relevant. Better shot designs, hotter charges, and finally squeeze-bore adapters all pushed obsolescence back for a time. The adapter did its job in technical terms, but the world around it moved on. Today, drawings, reports, and the odd surviving sleeve tell its story in quiet detail, a reminder of how much thought went into getting a little more out of a seemingly modest gun.